Hey, it's Drybear. And the time has finally come. Druid is coming to Path of Exile 2. We've got an announcement of the stream broadcast coming in like a week and a half here. It's pretty short on that. And then December 11th, the new league will be starting for Path of Exile 2, including the Druid class. So in celebration of this, today I'd like to recap what has been said about Druid over the last 2 years. It's actually been almost 2 years now since we got the initial Druid showcase. And you can tell by this footage that I'm using here. In the bottom left-hand corner, there's 5 flasks there instead of 2. You'll see when they open the inventory, they have like stacks of gold, like physical gold. It's really old footage, but I want to recap what they said back then, some of the things that we've been data mining and hearing rumors and stuff like that about Druid right now, as well as what we think is going to be in the patch in a couple weeks here and reasons why you can get excited to log in. Additionally, if this interests you at all, you don't have Path of Exile 2 in their early access, paid access state right now. They will be doing a free weekend December 12th at 11 a.m. through December 15th at 11 a.m. Pacific time, so Pacific time zone. So this is going to be another free weekend. They did this for the Abyss League as well. They're doing it again, so if you are interested, you can try out the Druid and the new stuff on December 12th, just after the league goes live. And again, there will be a full broadcast on December 4th at 11 a.m. Pacific, going over the Druid and all that kind of stuff, like the actual what's in the league and that sort of thing. And we'll be going over that once it comes out. And then December 12th, it will be the actual like a league launch for the Druid League. Now, the first thing I want to touch on before we go diving in on all the stuff that's been said about Druid up until now is I want to highlight how important this class actually is for the game in general, just based on their overall game design and how all the systems mesh together in general, right? So this is actually one of the most important classes. I would actually argue that the second strength class and also the second strength int hybrid class are probably the most important classes that we can get right now, just because the whole left side of the talent tree in general is super underrepresented. Like Warrior by itself struggles so hard because there's so many things that they're missing out on, whereas a lot of like the right side of the tree and the top side of the tree, the fact that both int classes are in now, the fact that both dexterity classes are in now, that means like Ranger, Huntress, Sorceress, Witch are very well fleshed out because they can dip into their other class, like their counterpart inside of that stat, to blend things together, right? Witches can use Sorceress spells to balance things out. Hunters can use Ranger skills to balance things out. But when we look at the left side of the screen here, that hasn't been the case, right? Warrior has been struggling really hard because there's no second strength class in the game right now. There isn't a second dex strength hybrid class in the game. There's only one right here, and there's only one. There's none here, right? Like, so we have no Templar, no Druid. So this whole side is missing skills, synergies, and things like that. We have no second strength class and no second dex strength hybrid class, right? So warriors relying on things like slams or bleeds or aftershocks or things like that really struggle on that front, and they have nothing to blend into. So now that we're finally getting another class that's showing up over here, this is going to make big waves because some of the shapeshifting and primal magics will be utilized by the casters, right? Because it is an int hybrid, so you could use things like tornado or volcano or earthquake and stuff like that in sorceress builds or witch builds. But also some of the bear forms and some of the slams that come with the primal magic can then be picked up by warrior, which I think will open up a lot of really cool opportunities. So I just wanted to highlight how important a release like this is. I'm super excited for this first int strength hybrid here at the top. We definitely need the second, the second strength character over here. And I also think that shadow, traps, daggers, things like that, will also make a very big splash in the game overall. And as these classes come online, the theory crafting is going to get more and more interesting. All right, enough yapping. Let's talk about Druid in general. So because they are a spellcaster hybrid, let's first talk about the weapon option here as well. Most of the characters in the game right now have a primary weapon. Quarterstaffs for monks, bows for rangers, mercenaries have the crossbow. Every class has their primary weapon. However, there is one class in the game right now that doesn't actually have a primary, well, two classes that don't have a primary weapon. That's Witch and Sorceress. Technically, they don't have a primary weapon. It's just the magic that they use, right? You have sorcery, or you have like the witch style magic that's there, and those are their own thing without requiring a weapon. But because the Druid has been in this limbo of between this or that, there's a lot of theories on what's going to actually happen for the weapon and playstyle for the Druid in general. Now, honestly, if you go in and you do an uncut skill gem here, we can see Occult is for Witch, right? We go down and we have the Elemental for Sorceress, and again, these aren't tied to weapons, and the same thing comes for Primal as well, right? You can see that Templar were to get a flail for that, but Primal has kind of been thought of as the same of these three caster spellcaster elements in that they don't have a primary weapon, which means we might be getting some spellcaster weapons coming with the Druid as well, which is excellent, because I think, you know, between staves and like wands and stuff like that, and like, you know, the scepters and whatever that we have from these has actually opened up a lot of really cool build opportunities, not just for the classes that have them, but also the other classes in the game that might be able to utilize it. There's plenty of, like, there's mercenary builds that'll hot swap to a staff for a buff, and there's, you know, ranger builds that will pull out a wand and stuff like that, and you can get some really cool stuff out of that, and hopefully Primal fits into that same kind of, you know, widespread flexible strategy. It's also been data mined that they might be using talismans, like maybe they have like talismans or little charms, or, you know, like, you know, more like holy or naturalistic kind of things, just like weapon types, which, you know, what's great about that is that these spellcaster weapons usually come with their own inherent skill, which is awesome, because that opens up a lot more opportunities, again, not just for that class, but other classes as well, which is going to be really cool. And I also think there's a bunch of synergies in the kit as well that are worth mentioning from the same standpoint. We talked about the spellcasting opportunities, so when it comes to spells in general for Druid, some of the ones that they've already showed off over the last couple years are Lightning Storm, which is kind of like the elemental storm that we have for the sorceress, and maybe it ended up getting bleed over. Keep in mind that a lot of this stuff is old and might have been repurposed already, and we might see something different. But you can see on screen there was like this persistent lightning storm. We have a little bit of this with like the tri-element storm for sorceress, where it sits in one spot and you get different elements on it, but this one is persistent for lightning, which is pretty cool, and might have some other elements that go along with it too. Maybe there might be some, you know, crossovers for infusions and things like that for sorceress, which would be really awesome. But, you know, these kind of persistent spells I think fit Druid well and can be used in other builds. The next spell is a big one, which is Tornado. So you see that, you can put it down. I mean, it's not like, you know, the Act 2 characters that have that Dust Devil that's going around. They have mentioned that this is, at least in the past, not only has like a wind element to it, doing damage that way, but also has a vortex effect as you'd expect from a tornado, which means that potentially as you modify this skill and put it in builds, it might give you a gathering option, because there are definitely some builds in Path of Exile 2 right now that they have decent AoE, but the AoE is very localized, right? It's not very wide, it doesn't cover the whole screen. Now, some builds will blow the whole screen up instantly, especially once you get super late game, but there are some builds that are a little bit more localized, so having a gathering ability to vortex enemies in and keep them in one spot using the tornado is going to be awesome. And the last spell that they showed off previously was the Volcano. This one, if you played Diablo 2, you're going to recognize immediately. Like the molten boulder and the volcano to me are so iconic for Diablo 2 Druid, has always been the case. And as we know, Path of Exile 1 was inspired for the original Diablo 2 aesthetic, so it does make sense that, you know, if we're going to be doing Druid, we're going to be bringing that back online. So what's cool about Volcano is it is, again, another persistent effect. The last time they showed off Druid, they mentioned they liked having persistent or like more passive effects for spellcasting for Druid, so that if you want to use the rest of the Druid kit where you're shape-shifting into animals and beasts that don't cast spells, it allows you to put the spell down and then shapeshift without having to constantly cast spells over and over. And I think Volcano fits into that really well. And what's cool about Volcano, kind of like the Fissure that we have for Warrior and things like that, is they've mentioned a lot of interactions with slams, which is big. Warrior needs that right now. We need more ways to interact with slams, aftershocks, bleeds, aggravating bleeds. Like, those are mechanics in the game that are very underrepresented compared to other mechanics. And so adding in a Volcano, like maybe you could do a Warrior build with a Fissure. Like, you put the Fissure down, you cast the Volcano down because it doesn't require a weapon, and then you start slamming on the Volcano. And they've already mentioned that they're, you know, the last time they showed this, that when you put the Volcano down, if the Volcano ever gets hit by a slam attack, it will erupt more and show more projectiles, right? So you could do like a Fissure build, put the Fissures down, put the Volcano down, and then slam, 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 slam. And maybe that increases the opportunities for interesting builds, not just for Druid, but also for Warrior. Now, over the time that they've been talking about Druid in general, they have mentioned that they want at least 3 shape-shifting forms for Druid, and they even kind of like offhand mentioned 4, although it seems like it's going to be 3. And the only one they had shown up until now was Bear. So in Bear, we knew Bear was coming. And so a lot of people theorized Lycanthrope. Again, Diablo 2, you know, we got like the Bear and the Wolf. So Wolf was already been shown in the teaser, so we know that the 2 forms confirmed already are Bear and Wolf. And the third, potentially 4th, but probably just 3rd for the shape-shifting forms that we have for Druid has been kind of a mystery. However, like 6 to 8 months ago, there was like this weird rumor data mine that the 3rd form was Dragon, or dragonkin. Like we saw words of like wyvern in the database, dragon form in the database, which would be kind of interesting. I think generally when you think of druid, you usually think of, you know, bears and wolves, but also there's a ton of druidic aspects like snakes, spiders, birds, hawks, stuff like that, right? And even like dragons. And I also like, you know, like Last Epoch's take on it, bringing in spriggans and nature magic and things like that could be bringing it together. So far we have druid and wolf form, which is pretty cool. And hopefully we have like druid being slower and beefier and more warrior-like, and potentially maybe wolf is more like shadow monk-like, very like up in your face, a lot faster, that sort of thing. So let's dive a little bit into what they've talked about on the shape-shifting part of this. You can see this in the animations that are going on right now on screen from the old teaser that they showed in general, but they do kind of like the Diablo 4 thing where when you use a shape-shifting ability, it's not just transformation. Like you're not just transforming because you're using the ability. The ability itself is an attack. It's an actual skill that does an attack or does an effect or stuns or has some kind of CC or something like that. Like it isn't an ability by itself, but by activating the ability, it transforms you automatically into that form, which is again, is like the Diablo 4 strategy of doing this, which I think is really great, which means that you can kind of, you know, use your abilities out of form and then use an ability to get into form. And then when you use bear form, wolf form, or dragon or spider, whatever it is they end up going with for the final forms, we'll be able to kind of manage that and use it by shape-shifting into it and using our shape-shifting abilities, shape-shifting out and using spells if you want to. And I'm sure there's probably going to be builds that stay in shapeshift form for as long as possible, if not indefinitely. Now, they also touted this about 2 years ago. I don't know if this is still going to be the case when Druid finally comes out, but they mentioned that Druid is going to be very animation heavy. And it's actually something that they mentioned a couple months ago on why Druid didn't come out with the Abyss League, is because he's so animation heavy, right? Because again, any character that gets added into Path of Exile 2, since they can use any of the weapons, when you add a character, you now have to make sure that Huntress can swing a staff, and you have to make sure that Monk can shoot a crossbow. There's tons of animations, a lot of work that goes along with that, and anytime you do a shape-shifting or second form character, the cost of that character goes way up. Like Diva Overwatch having a robot and a separate character, things like that. It gets way expensive to do that. And they also mentioned that they wanted to do seamless animation transformation. So what I mean by that is you can go from starting to rear up as a bear and then going down into a slam, but if you do another slam attack while you're in bear form and you're exiting a slam animation on the bear, it's faster, right? So maybe there's going to be some animation canceling in there, but they talked a lot about, trying to min-max your animation timings, right? So you'll shapeshift out, cast a spell, shapeshift in, and then since you're already in attack animation in wolf form, for example, there might be a skill that is then faster in the animation timing because you're already in the attack stance in wolf form, for example. So they want you to kind of play around with that, and you'll see a little bit in this footage too, as the bear shapeshifts in and out of form and uses different kinds of attacks. Another cool, implication for Druid in general is they also do have summons, right? The skill that they've shown so far is summon wolves, which you'll see here in a second, be able to summon wolves and they'll spawn out. They also mentioned that they wanted the summons to have not only, it's a summon activation, you summon, you see the wolf jumping on and attacking, not only going to have that same kind of, you have a pet that's going on, but also, active abilities. And we've seen this a lot more with the necromancers / witch style minions as well. The fact that they have an active ability that they can use to impact the battlefield. So wolves granting increased critical strike or things like that. So having more summons, again, means that we have cool bear attacks and shape-shifting attacks and druid attacks, but it also means that pet-based builds that have minions and stuff now have access to new minions. And it's one of my favorite parts about Path of Exile when they add new content is the character comes out, yes, but the implications. Think of the implications. Now, aside from Druid, I was trying to give a couple notes on what we think is going to be happening for the release of this. We just got Act 4 with the last patch. I think it's very unlikely that we'll get an Act 5 with this patch. They did mention that they don't want to be in early access forever, and they are kind of kicking up the pace on how they release the content here, but I don't think that we're going to get an Act 5 so soon after Act 4. I think this is going to be like new league, end game improvements, core game improvements, as well as Druid, a Druid, new spells, new abilities, new things like that. So I wouldn't expect anything on that front of trying to get Act 5, but I do think there's going to be a good amount of end game changes. They did, with Abyss League, they did changes with how the towers function, how the tablets function, playing around with the end game, but that also left a lot of holes in what needs to be improved on in the end game in general. I think the Atlas skill tree definitely needs some love because I think a lot of Atlas skill trees in general end up looking very similar. There's also areas of the Atlas skill tree, especially on the end in-game activities, you know, like Breach and stuff like that, that don't really have the kind of oomph you would expect from a talent tree. So hopefully some Atlas skill tree changes that make the end game a lot more interesting. Potentially new bosses and enemies. They did this with the last 2 patches, new bosses and enemies coming online. We're kind of reaching a point where there's just so many that I don't know how much more impact that's going to have, especially if we're not getting a new act or a new expansion to the story in general. I don't know how much we'll get, but we might get some new bosses and some new enemies as they try to, you know, they said they eventually wanted, I think, what was it, like 400 bosses and like 500, 600, 700, 800 enemies in the game that they could use for end game mapping. It is great for variety because it means that every time you go into a map, you can get different enemies and different bosses and that sort of thing. It does keep the game enriched, and I think that's something that's, you know, reasonable to expect in this patch. I also feel like we're kind of due for some passive skill tree changes as well. I mean, in general, they have been getting better about this. Like in the last 2 major updates, they have put some new nodes in here, like some new stuff down here. They put a bunch of new stuff over here, like near Ranger. They did a bunch of new stuff near Monk, you know, like with the Hollow Palm and some of the extra triggers, something for like endurance charges and stuff like that. They've also added some new things in here, like the avatar forms and like, you know, the infusions and whatever else. They've been adding more and more and more to this, but I do think that there's definitely some major gaps on the left side of the tree. You can like look how dense this side of the tree is. Like just kind of take in how many dots and visual information you get, and then look over here. You can tell that it's just like the skill tree is just not prepared for Templar or Druid at this point, because like just the density of nodes. Look how much empty space there is here on this option compared to some of the other sides of the tree that are a lot more dense and filled in. So I do think that you know, it would be apropos for them to be able to fill in these gaps and add more. And I think they were probably just putting this off for the time being because, again, there were no, you know, strength, intelligence, hybrid classes on this side of the tree that would have benefited as much from these. Now, obviously, there's going to be like totem warrior builds that will go up here and grab this stuff. There are some witch builds that will go over here. There's sorceress builds that will go over here. But obviously, you know, once Templar and Druid come online, then this side of the tree starts becoming a lot more important and valuable. And I think it's reasonable to expect that there will be some additions to this side of the tree. I also think there will probably be some changes to the Atlas. So what they had mentioned in the last patch, when they went through and they started updating the towers and how the towers function, they mentioned that they wanted to do more, but they couldn't make it into the last patch with the Abyss League, which means, logically, you would expect that there will be more endgame changes in general. I think a lot of people love the mapping endgame system for Path of Exile 1, where you just use the device and use your maps, and there's definitely a lot of people that are very vocal about how they feel about the endgame Atlas map in general, how it sprawls, the fact that it just goes on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever, and you're just going and going and going and going and going. I keep clicking on stuff accidentally. But they also talk about how, like, you can't search anything on the Atlas. So if I wanted to find like a monster node or a ritual node or something, there's no search function. Sometimes it doesn't load properly. There are like nodes that don't function. And they've also talked about how they want to improve the experience of doing the endgame Atlas as well, of just like discovering things, finding the citadels, doing the uber bosses, blah, 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 whatever, whatever. So I think you could probably expect that there'd be some Atlas, potentially even some major Atlas mix-ups on how the endgame systems function. But that's what we got. Let me know what you think, what your predictions are for the patch. If you're excited, Druid finally coming. I think Druid is probably the most anticipated class for the game right now, and we'll also, you know, as I've been mentioning, it's not just about the class, but it's also about the implications of what it can provide. And I think it's going to create a lot of really cool options for how the game feels, what builds we can make, and hopefully they just keep making bigger and bigger improvements over time. I loved the changes they made with the Abyss League. There's still a lot of problems that need to be solved, but they're making incremental improvements, and that's all we can ever ask about this. So I'm very excited to see it, but let me know what you think about the Druid announcement, the new season coming in just a few weeks here, as well as, you know, what you feel about Path of Exile 2 down below in the comments. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.